counted among the outlaws. He said, "Come, follow me." People from all walks of life since have been becoming outlaws.
From my viewpoint, and as you'll let me know, but I think that the majority of scholars, whether of faith or not, believe there was a Jesus that lived during that time period. The question is of his claims or the church claims. Mm-hmm. So the notion of, do you believe in Jesus? I always didn't like that phrase because it goes right along with, do you believe in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny? Well, do you believe in Santa Claus? Well, there was a St. Nicholas. You can take something to its root. Do you believe in Jesus? 100%. And most historians, I think, do. Mm-hmm. So this conversation is kind of outside of the claims of Christianity and of himself. But how can you put into context for the lay person in this brief time we have of just how do we know that this person existed?
For the lay believer, I think we have to start. We do start with faith. That is there. If you want to talk about what kind of material culture that we have as evidence of the life of Jesus, the short answer is we have zero of him personally when he walked on the earth. And that's not surprising because archaeology as a field, we tend to focus on time in chunks of hundreds or even thousands of years. Jesus was only on the earth for 33 years. And when you look at what the Bible describes his life as, everything he did was action. He was moving. During his ministry, he was walking around. So he didn't leave behind a church for us to find, or a synagogue for us to find, or a house for us to find, or anything like that. His miracles were things that would not have left evidence, typically. Right. So that is not something for us to be discouraged by. That is just a fact. What we see in the scriptures, though, is an accurate historical description of what life looked like during the first century. And we do have an absolute ton of archaeology from what would be called the Roman period. And so you can go and there are mosaics. There's evidence that the world that is being described there, the world that Jesus lived in, existed in the way that it is described. The struggles that the Jews were going through at the time, the difficulties they were having with the Romans as far as autonomy. Could they rule themselves? The wars that they would get into shortly after Jesus's life. All of that is borne out in other historical records. We have Josephus, of course, who is actually an unreliable narrator, but still we can learn a ton from everything he left behind.
So Flavius Josephus, historian at the time, mm-hmm. What was his role? He was not a believer, and then why do you say that his was, may or may not be accurate?
Well, so he was a Jew, and he was fighting against the Romans, and he basically lost his battle. I'm cutting through a lot of the history and giving the Cliff Notes version. He lost, but then he basically ends up going and working for the Romans, and the Romans commission him to write the history of the Jews. And so what he writes is essentially Roman propaganda.
Right.
There's a lot in there that is historically accurate, but we have to recognize that there's a slant and there's a bias in there. Also, we have realized because of archaeology that a lot of what he described actually was not accurate. A great example of that, or a very sad example of that, is the story of Masada. He describes Masada as having a palace up at the top, and it is from him that we get the story that there was a mass suicide of the Jews before the Romans invaded there. Well, what archaeologists have found is there are actually 3 palaces up there. And the way that Josephus described Masada only proves that he never actually saw it for himself. I don't know what source material he was drawing from, but he told a story that ended up painting the Jews in a particular way that was beneficial to the Romans. a debate still rages as to whether or not the great suicide event happened. Most people say now, no, that's probably not what happened. What we find up there are pottery sherds that have people's names written on them. And for a long time, those were interpreted to go along with what Josephus said, because not a lot of archaeological work had been done at the time. And the idea was that those sherds would have been dropped into a bag, names would have been drawn. And as names were drawn, those people went and they killed groups of people until at the end there were only 10 men left, and they drew names, and until there was just one person left standing who was supposed to commit suicide. So that is the story that he tells. Sherds have been found. But the way sherds get dropped in, we see this throughout the Bible. We actually see it in the Old Testament. That is how governance happened among the Israelites and then later the Jews. We see this with the way Saul is chosen as king. Is sherd when the Bible talks about casting lots, a lot of us tend to think that, that's rolling dice. That's actually not what's being described. The lot would be the sherd that would actually be cast into a bag. And so what's actually a better translation there would be something more like drawing lots. So a lot would be drawn out. Well, so finding these sherds at Masada is not evidence that his story is accurate. It's evidence that some sort of governance was going on there. Somehow they were making decisions and ruling amongst themselves. But the main thing is we don't find the kind of skeletal remains that you would expect to find. So,
right.
And that's the primary thing right there is there was no evidence of this mass suicide event up there actually. So we can learn a lot, but we need to take Josephus and really any writer, myself included, you want to take everybody with a grain of salt. It's so important to know where writers come from, what their biases are, what their blind spots are, what they know. And that's also why writers over time, our thoughts and everything, it should change. We should all change and grow as we learn more and as we internalize all of that. So Josephus, wonderful source, but remember, it's Roman propaganda.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to focus on the archaeology, but I do want to point out, isn't that one of the arguments of the accuracy of the New Testament writers in that, or the probability of what they said could be true, in that if Josephus is writing in a favorable light to Rome, these writers wrote in an unfavorable light for themselves over and over again, which doesn't fit that pattern of history writing.
Oh, absolutely.
So their writing lines up with history, and they did the not typical, showed all of their errors false.
What archaeology and comparative literature really shows us is that what we have in the Gospels is completely plausible. There's no reason for us to doubt it for historical reasons. There's nothing really surprising in there. Even the discussions of when you look at Judas and Zealot, and it's debated exactly which form of zealotry was being followed at the time. There were multiple factions at the time, but those little words that are just slipped in there, there's so much history behind them. And those are words that, 30 years later and longer would result in the Jewish wars and in these revolts. And so all of that was known to the writers of the Bible, and they'll make references to things that were happening for them contemporary that we don't understand because they don't take the time to explain. Now, what I mean by zealot is, this is what was happening with us historically, because these writers knew what was going on. They knew their readers would know what was going on, so they didn't waste time on that. What they told us about was Jesus. That was the point there. And so even the absence of some of those historical details is absolutely expected to be
assumption,
there. If it was overly explained, then you'd wonder why.
Yeah, right. But in talking in actual archaeology, things have been dug up as far as maybe not Jesus himself, but
Thankfully.
some of the other people, some of the other characters, if you will, in the stories, like Caiaphas. So the Caiaphas Ossuary, did I pronounce that right?
Yeah.
What about that? Is that legit? And who is he?
Yeah, I think so. Caiaphas was one of the rulers at the time. He was would have been head priest at the time. That particular artifact, it doesn't smack of fakery to me, But anytime anything isn't found in situ, and that is what often happens with a lot of ossuaries, especially when you look at the James ossuary, then
In
there's
situ
always...
being
Oh, I'm
that
sorry. In
term.
situ. In situ means found in place.
Right, okay.
So found archaeological excavations are more and more scientific as the years go by. At this point, anytime anything is found in the ground, we're not just photographing it and making drawings the way that we were when I first started in 2004, but things actually get tapped and tagged and located by GPS. It's actually located in 4 dimensions. We know the exact time and the exact location when everything is coming up out of the ground. And so that is very important for comparing artifacts as they come out and helping us understand the timeline of the history. What is up close to the top is going to be newer. What is down toward the bottom is going to be older. And so you want to find something in situ because the artifact itself, while an ossuary is a really cool find, especially if it's intact, if it has writing on it. You can learn something from the artifact itself, but you can learn even more from what was around it. And so you want to know, well, okay, it's the ossuary says Caiaphas. It doesn't say high priest, which is a little bit curious. You would maybe expect that to be found there. Well, so if we know that around him were people who were members of his family, specifically men who were in his family, then that helps us to better understand if this is just any old Caiaphas or if this is the one that we're thinking of who was high priest. And then, also you can see what happened around it. How was it buried? What kinds of tools were used? Were there any sort of... This is less so with New Testament stuff, but when you go to the Old Testament time period, were there grave goods in there? And you can learn not just about the people in death, but you can learn a lot about what they were like in life too. So anytime an artifact comes to market and isn't found in the ground first, then it's going to throw up question marks. And you're never, no matter how many scientific tests are run, no matter how many people come out in support of it, you're never going to 100% know for sure that it's not a fake, because fakers are really, really, really good at what they do, because when they do a good job, they know that they can make tens and even hundreds of millions of dollars on an artifact. So their science is just as advanced as the archaeologists are, and sadly maybe more so sometimes.
And an ossuary is, so if I've got this right, someone would pass away, you do lay them in a tomb until all of their flesh is rotted away, and then you gather up the bones and you put them in a stone box, which is the ossuary.
Yes.
And then you assume that they're writing the description of who this person is, or maybe what family they come from, hopefully.
Yes. And sometimes you...
And is that common, or is that for a wealthier class, or is that kind of... How often was that?
That's really common. How ornate the boxes are in the first century tends to, and how precious maybe the stone is, if it was an easily available stone, or if it was something that got shipped in from somewhere. There are going to be grades with anything. I mean, honestly, if you go to a cemetery today and look at the differences in tombstones that you see there, it's going to vary based on preference and maybe the finances of the person who is buried there or their family. But the practice itself is ancient, and you get these stone ossuaries by the time of the Roman era, the first century. But prior to that, with more Old Testament time, going all the way back to David, if you look in Samuel, whenever a good king would die, it would give the record of his life, and it would say King David ruled for 40 years before he was gathered to his fathers. And that is a euphemism for death, but that is also literally what happened. And so we find in older time period these caves where, yes, a body would be laid out in the center. There would be sometimes niches in the wall, and as the bones were loosened, the bones would be gathered together. Sometimes they would just be placed in the niches, but more often what you would see is them going into what we call amphora, really large jars. And so when you say ossuary, I think most of us tend to think of the stone ones that come from the first century, but there are tons of ossuaries from hundreds and even 1,000 years prior to that. So that is a very long standing tradition of burial among the Israelites and then later the Jews.
Oh, I'm veering off of the Jesus topic, but you made me, so it's your fault. David, so
Related to Jesus, it's fair.
It ancestor. So David's tomb, I've been to that, but that's not legit, right? Have they ever found what they believe is the bones of David, or is that it? Yeah, I didn't think so.
So David and Solomon, if when I was an undergrad, I was taught that the scholarly community at that time basically didn't even believe they existed, because up until 1994, there was zero what we call extra biblical evidence of Solomon or David. That changed in 1994 with the discovery of what's called the Teldan Stela. And it mentions on there, it has the words House of David. That's the first time David was ever found. Any artifact is going to be argued about by lots and lots of professors. But because we went so long without having this extra biblical material evidence of them, something developed called the low chronology. And there is a group of scholars out there, although this thankfully is falling out of favor as more is being found. But the low chronology basically takes David and Solomon out of the historical record, slams the historical record together, and gives all of the building accomplishments of Solomon to Ahab. And then it takes David, and people who follow that, they may say, yeah, maybe he was an historical character, but they want to make him instead into a tribal leader or something like that. And so they don't give him any credit for the city of David or anything like that. And so, no, there's very little physical evidence of David or Solomon. David specifically. Solomon, we have more. I do not follow the low chronology. I believe they were historical figures, and I see in artifacts that there's plenty of evidence, especially of Solomon, and that being really in the cities that he built. The cities of Megiddo, Gezer, and Hatzor are impressive, and they were sort of new in the way that they were created at the time. With these, they were military outposts. They housed hundreds of horses, large cavalries, all of this. They had gates that weren't just 4 chambers like you were seeing in cities prior to those. They were 6-chambered gates. They were really very impressive. And there is a theme during the time of Solomon that to me matches up not just among the cities that he's building, but also with the historical account of all of this money flooding into Israel while he is a king, because the kingdom is united under him, because of all of the trade that is happening with all of the different cultures that you see described in the Bible. And then also there is evidence from other cultures of their interactions with Israel too. As I was saying earlier, it's hard to pin it down to just maybe the reign of Solomon, but you see a lot from that Iron Age period that is being described in the Bible. So to me, there's plenty of evidence of both of them, though not their owns.
Right. So around Jesus, what are the most convincing or maybe eye-opening discoveries that have come out of the dirt around the life and times, or even the stories out of the Gospels?
For me, it's really the most recent one, and that's Magdala. Because with Magdala was only uncovered about 10 years ago. The city of Migdal, it's a modern, very, very small, blink and you miss it, city right along the Sea of Galilee. The people who lived there wanted to build a new structure, and so they sent in the heavy equipment, as you do, to start excavating things in a construction kind of way, not in an archaeology way. And they just started scratching, and about 6 inches below the surface, they found these amazing mosaics. And the Catholic Church came in, I believe it's a Franciscan order, came in, took charge, and they are doing a lot of archaeological work there. And what they have found is an actual synagogue from the time that Jesus was speaking in the area that has come out of the ground and that was untouched. With most of our Christian artifacts, and artifacts isn't really a word, relic may be a better word. When you go to the Holy Land and you go to see the Christian places, what you typically see are churches built on top of places someone said something great happened in. You don't get a lot of physical remains coming out that we know are from that time, because layers of building happened on top of it. what's coming out of Magdala was actually there. And the Bible doesn't tell us that Jesus went to Magdala and spoke, but it does talk about all of the places around the Sea of Galilee and in Galilee where he went and spoke. And for me, going there and seeing all that, that was the closest I kind of felt, because they've pulled an entire synagogue out. The stones around it are still there. The lectern is still there. The mosaic floors are amazing, because around 100 there was an earthquake that went through there, and when the earthquake happened, it rolled the floors as earthquakes do, and then once the earthquake was over, it froze in time. You still have the rolls there from where the earthquake went through. It has been untouched by archaeologists, by grave robbers, by absolutely anybody else. And so you can see then it tells us a lot, I guess, more about Mary of Magdala, because they talk about her somehow being wealthy. The details are scant, but you look at Magdala, it was an incredibly wealthy city. You can tell by the sizes of the houses that were there. You can tell by the fish markets, the multiple fish markets that they had at the place. And then their focus on their religion, on Judaism at the time, was very, very important, because you have this massive synagogue, but then you also have these things called mikvah, the plural's mikvot. They're these baths that have to have running waters in them. And so the people who created these well over 2,000 years ago, they went and they dug down until they found running groundwater, and they built these. The water still runs in them today. If you go and visit, they actually have pumps down into these things trying to pump the water out of them so that they can preserve them for people to be able to come see them, because so much money and effort and ingenuity went into that. And so seeing that city, you see what Jewish life was like at the time. And to me, that helps me understand where Jesus came from, who he was talking to, and what his world really looked like. So that's, to me, I would much rather see that than, see another church or something like that built over an area. That's the stuff that just really gets me excited.
What is the Pilate stone? So, of course, Pilate being Pontius Pilate, a Roman governor or prefect at the time, who's famous for questioning Jesus, claiming he was innocent, and sending him to his crucifixion.
Yeah.
What is the Pilate stone?
It is a stone that has the word Pilate on it. Archaeologists, we are not super creative with what we call things.
Yeah.
Look, stone with Pilate on it. Let's call it Pilate stone. That's kind of how it all goes. It probably would have been the cornerstone of a building that he would have built. You know how that works. You set a cornerstone to something and you put a date on it, or you say who was in charge of doing that sort of thing. We can't be sure, because technically it was not found in situ. It was found in what we call a secondary context. Actually, the same thing with the Tel Dan stela that I mentioned before that had House of David written on it. That was actually found in a secondary context as well. The Pilate stone was taken and it was used in the production of a later building at a later time. So what probably happened is whatever building it was that originally that stone was put into would have been destroyed probably around 70 when Rome came in and destroyed Jerusalem. Well, stones, unless that particular stone was cracked, they tend to kind of stick around, and so then they get reused. And that's something we see a lot in archaeology. Even with the building of walls, people would start building the foundation of a wall, digging down for it, and they'd run across stones that were used by previous occupants of that city. And instead of going and finding more stones, they just pull those old ones up and stick them in their new wall. And that's what happened with the Tel Dan stela.
And is there a ring they think might have been Pilate's?
I don't know. It's possible.
Watch out that one.
Sorry.
I'll edit out ones I catch you on, but since we stopped there, I just realized I didn't plug in my laptop, so this is a good place to pause. Hold on. I'd rather take a break than you go. Hold on. There we go. Whoops. Yep, you still there?
You're frozen. Oh, it's working its way back. It's pixelating. It's figuring it out.
Sorry about that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I looked at it. I'm like, why is my battery low? I shouldn't be on battery. today's a day where I had, I do have a full-time job. I'm a marketing director, and
Oh,
so I had another meeting with another laptop, and I had swapped it out, and I forgot to plug this one back in.
I understand.
All right.
I do not have another job. This is, yeah. I make aggressively negative income. Yeah, but it's my passion.
Yeah. Fun. All right. Since I don't have the printer, I don't have all those little notes of things. We'll just, am I still recording? Okay. So as you know, I'm a fan of your podcast now, and I haven't listened to all of them, but I am going to.
Oh, thank you. Some are better than others. There's a learning curve with podcasting. As I'm sure you know.
Yeah, for sure. I listen to audiobooks a lot when I'm driving here and to and fro, and yeah, I really like your podcast.
Thanks.
You don't go too much information, but it's so much. They're like podcasts you have to go back and listen to again to just, but yeah, I like the historical context, all the information you give, and in a non, I don't want to say nerdy way, but I guess I don't know how else to say it. Very...
That's okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Okay. Yeah. I appreciate that. I got to go to school and study all of this stuff, and there's so much that gets trapped up in the academy that doesn't make it out to the general public, that doesn't make it out into our churches. And this is the stuff that I love, because this is what brings the Bible alive to me, the physical stuff. And it encourages me to interact with the text even more. And that's how God and I talk. And I want to be able to share that with people. There's a member of my family who has said to me before something along the lines of, well, I'm just not smart enough to understand what you're talking about. And first off, she is. She absolutely is. For some reason, she thinks that. And I don't want anyone to ever feel like they're not smart enough to understand the Bible. That's not it. And also, I don't want people to think it's just boring, because it's not. I mean, it's history. I love general history, period. But it's people's lives and stories. But I mean, it's also scripture. It's Holy Scripture. So it's something we should fall in love with. And if material culture can help us to do that, then I want to share that with people. I want people to know what things mean, what strange words mean, what these customs were, what was going on in history, because all of that is the context against which, we've been given Scripture. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the Bible can be looked at as some big grandma's book that collects dust somewhere, and it's just some old thing of rules for old people. But if it is what it says it is, it's written by, through centuries, through people, by one source higher, some kind of, I hate to use the word alien, but some kind of up-spirit being, that spoke through people.
Yeah,
and
inspiration.
Inspiration that is divine. People are always asking, like, I do this, or I don't understand God, or I'm searching for God, or this or that. And it's like, he wrote a book. He wrote it through human history, and he wrote it through people's lives that all weaves together. And it's not a big, boring book. It's 66 individual books written throughout time by different people in different places that all work together. Mm-hmm. And you don't understand the world you're living in if you don't understand what's in there, because all civilizations have been built on some kind of belief system. Yeah. And those belief systems in general are referenced in Scripture. At least you can get a general concept of what everyone believes and why. And then there's a counter belief, and it tells you to go that way. Mm-hmm. But I don't think you're an educated person, no matter your degrees, if you don't at least know what's in Scripture. Yeah. And like you're saying, not a criticism to the church per se, but it gets capsulized down at these messages that you don't get the context of what you're doing. Or some of the things I like to talk about on the program are only because you don't really find them in the church. People's stories, their experiences, where you're allowed to ask questions and be real.
Yeah. Questioning is so important. And there are parts of Scripture that we don't understand on the surface. Some of that, I think, is because our culture is so completely different from the cultures in which those different books were written. But also some of what is described is just all of the wars and the genocide, especially that happens in the Old Testament. That's just not palatable. That's not comfortable to us. We don't like it. God knows that we don't like it, but it's in there. And I try to encourage people that when you find places in Scripture that you don't understand or that you don't like, instead of running away from it, try to press into it. And, try to learn more about what may be the context, be it literary or historical. And you're going to discover something about God as a result of doing that extra little bit of work to really dig into the Word. I do think that Scripture is intentionally mysterious. There are still words in there, especially in the Hebrew. I worked on a Bible translation for 7 years, and there are words in the Old Testament that do not occur anywhere else. We can't be 100% sure of what they mean. People debate these things, but we need to keep trying to figure that out. There's nothing wrong with saying we aren't 100% sure what the translation of this should be. I think that mystery is there. If we knew absolutely everything about God, well, then would he still be God? That mystery is part of who he is.
So this Jesus of Nazareth he lived, he was executed by the Romans, and he was buried. I believe those are historical facts. And where was he buried?
We don't know.
Okay.
People will tell you that they know, but we don't know. And
honestly, I've been to 2 of them, and I didn't know about the third until I listened to your podcast.
Okay, so there are 3 kind of declared sites of Jesus's burial. The most famous is in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and that is it's controlled by different factions of the church, but the way that came to be there is when Helen, and let me start by saying I am not Catholic. And so for me to talk about the saints and to talk about holy relics and that sort of thing, they don't really have a lot of spiritual meaning for me because I'm not of that tradition. I came from a Protestant tradition. But historically, Saint Helena went and talked to people in the area, and people would tell her, hey, this happened here, this happened there. And so anytime someone would tell her of an act of Jesus that happened
Helena
in Holy,
being
Helena,
the wife,
the mother of Constantine.
Mother of.
Yes, mother of. So she goes over there, and she people start telling her these are the places that things happen, and she starts commissioning churches to go up in those places. Over time, with all the wars in the area, a lot of those original churches end up getting destroyed, or at least needing to be remodeled or something like that. But these traditions, a lot of them continue. As I say, to me, it's a tradition. So that's where we get the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, is from her. The second place that you can visit is, maybe if you want to think of it as like the Protestant response to St. Helena, that is the Garden Tomb, which is, you can walk there. It's not very far away. It's next to a bus station. I encourage everyone to go. It is
in my office place. Right over here on a piano, I have one of the little communion cups they give you from there.
It's beautiful. It's an oasis in the middle of a hot, stony city. I should also say I've only ever been to Israel in June, July, and August, because that's when archaeological excavations happen. So I think of it as a beautiful, cool place. But it's possible if you go in other years, or other times of the year, you might have a different experience. I'm not sure, but it's a nice, cool area, and you'll get taken on a little tour there with tour guides who will point out basically rock formations and try to argue that this particular tomb that is cut there would have actually been where Jesus was laid instead. Archaeologically, it doesn't work. Everything that has been dug out from there, we can tell is actually from much, much later than when Jesus died and resurrected. So it doesn't fit from an archaeological perspective. And then the third site is actually in East Jerusalem. And it's a place called East Halpiot. It is a little community. Some people, about 20 or 30 years ago now, I'm not sure, time flies, the community was going to build some apartments, build some high rises. And as happens all the time in Israel, once you start digging, you find artifacts because they're just everywhere. And what they found were tombs, basically, like we were talking about earlier with the ossuaries. They found these the caves that had niches carved out that had ossuaries inside of them. And the names on those ossuaries match the names of people in Jesus's family. And there is one with Jesus's name on it. And so if you don't have to look very hard, if you search for this, you'll find documentaries out there about how this is the tomb of Jesus. I don't interpret it that way. This is from about the right time period. My interpretation of this is that this was probably a very early Christian family. The names that are there, there's multiple Marys, Joseph, all of the names that are there were very common in the first century. And so most Jewish families had women named Mary in them because Mary was their version of Miriam. These were women who were being named after Moses' sister. So it's people looking at the tomb and saying 1 + 1 = 3. I try not to do that. To me, I think it does show, though, the prevalence of early Christianity at the time, how important it was. These people could have been named after members of Jesus' family, after apostles. There are early Christian symbols that are found down in there. So that's a third place. People who don't believe he was resurrected will say that they have found actually his ossuary there. Another potentially interesting thing about this find, you may have heard of the James ossuary.
Sure.
That came to light. I was in college, so it was in 2002, I believe, when it hit the market. And it was an ossuary that a very well-known antiquities dealer in Jerusalem got a hold of actually in the 70s. And he just held on to it until he decided to put it to market. And it says James... the James ossuary.
Right.
James, brother of Jesus. Yes, that's what it said. And so what is debated about it, first off, it was not found in situ. It sat in the back of a guy's closet for 30 years or so before he brought it to market. And there continues to be debate about whether or not it is real and whether or not the inscription on there is real. What is neat to me, though, is this other tomb that was found in East Halpiot. There is basically one hole where an ossuary is missing, and you could tell it had been pulled out. And so what some people have theorized is that actually that James ossuary probably came from that East Halpiot tomb because there wasn't another James among there. So the one thing we may have actually found with this tomb is where the James ossuary came from. But again, it's all going to be theory because unless stuff is found in situ, then there's too many opportunities for people to get in there and make forgeries, and that's just a shame.
Yeah, I remember I haven't been. Well, it was a long time since I've been in Israel, but was it Peter's home that they have found? How would they know that's Peter's home in Capernaum?
So similar to the St. Helena stuff, but not as new. What has come out of the ground, so when they started excavating it, they could tell that it was being used as a church. And as they started peeling off the layers of, if you want to think about, a building that has lots of wallpaper on it, as they started peeling off the first century equivalent of the wallpaper, they could tell that walls had been moved and the building had been changed over time. And that prior to it being a church, it was actually a home. And so by the 2nd century, when it was being used as a church, there was already the tradition that was Peter's home. So it's the same thing as how Helena picked her spots, but it's a lot closer in history. So I have less trouble believing that actually may have been Peter's home than I do, trusting some of the other Catholic
And
sites.
tradition or oral tradition is not 100%, but it's way more reliable than we would think of it as today, right? Because most people didn't read. They passed on even God's laws and scripture by oral tradition.
Yes.
That this was something they lived by, faith. And so it wasn't just like I have a terrible memory and, I'm trying to relay a story. You play the phone, what is it, operator or whatever, where you go around and it changes. That this was something they were good at.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. And for Peter's house, you don't really see a reason why they would have lied about that necessarily.
Yeah.
Like it seems like a very natural progression of the building there. It fits with time. We know Peter was a historical character. There's not a lot of question there. With St. Helena, you have to consider we're talking 300 years later. So a lot more is lost or changed in 300 years than, say, 100 years. And you also have the mother of the emperor who's coming through here with the stated goal of trying to find holy relics and holy locations. And she's going into these communities asking this question. And so, I mean, there's going to be, I think, a little bit of peer pressure to be like, oh, yeah, look at that little thing over there. Thus and such happened over there, to keep her happy.
Right.
There's lots of these weren't necessarily organic traditions that were just passed down. There very quickly was a state-run element that got mixed up in all of that. Money too. She's going to be building a church here. Oh, well, we're into construction. We can make some money off of this. Let's tell her, yeah, we need to build a church over here. So there's just lots of room for manipulation and all of that to happen there. Plus, I kind of like to tell the story. In my family, I have one branch of my family who is related to President James Madison. And so much so that my grandmother, her name was Anne Madison. Madison has been a woman's name in my family for many years, long before it was popular. And we have this video from, when was Maddie born? Like 1990. When my cousin was born, it was her first birthday. And my grandmother is sitting there talking to Maddie's other grandmother and explaining to her why her name is Maddie and this, great, wonderful tradition of history in our family. We are directly descended from Dolly Madison. And we filmed this video after my grandmother passed away, going through her things. And I'm sitting there with a few members of my family and we're watching it and we're all like, wait, what? That's insane. First off, why would you say Dolly Madison instead of James Madison? I think most people would reference the president instead of Dolly. But bigger than that, Dolly and James Madison never had children. We are not directly descended from James Madison. No one is. We're actually related to his brother. But that's, roughly about 200 years of tradition that got passed down through time. And my grandmother, she was saying it in full belief. She thought that was absolutely accurate. We just happen to know our history maybe a little bit better than Granny did. And then, there's been subsequent work on her genealogy and all that. But that just kind of shows how what was true had a kernel of truth, even just in 200 years, even among family, it can kind of grow and change. So oral tradition is not infallible, but, and it certainly was very, very important in the ancient world.
Okay, I have to ask this. Your brief opinion on the infamous Shroud of Turin.
Okay. So I think it's fake. I don't think it's real. The shroud has gone through carbon dating testing, and carbon dating is not perfect, but it really is very, very good. It is not going to tell you, the day that a frog kicked the bucket, but it's going to get you within 100 years of it, typically. Okay. And so the carbon dating that was done on the material, I want to say it's been almost 50 years now since any sort of testing had been done. It said that the material was dated to, I believe, around the 12th century, something like that. Carbon dating has improved since then. We have electron microscopes. We have so much more science and technology now. It would be really great to go back and retest the Shroud of Turin now. But we can't because the Catholic Church doesn't allow that to happen. And I think that's sort of the big question in the archaeological community is if you really do believe this is authentic, why not let us try? Why not let us see if actually the carbon dating would agree now after it's improved after all this time? Let us take a look at that blood. The big debate over the years has been, is it blood or is it paint with pigments? And that's something we could certainly suss out now. But the way it's held in secrecy is really the reason, because we don't have as many scientific answers as we would like. That's really the reason I look at it as a piece of art. As much as we know now, I think it probably was medieval, and it holds a lot of value. I'm not one to throw out traditions and art with the bathwater. Just because it didn't come out of the ground, just because it's not archaeological, doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. I see the Shroud of Turin as teaching us a lot about our Christian ancestors. That was really important to someone, that assuming it is created, that was really important enough to someone that they wanted, to make this. And so it doesn't have to be without value, but it is not proof of Jesus. And we also, as Christians, we don't need that. I talk sometimes about the Bible's big three, the big three missing artifacts that I think we all would love to find: Noah's Ark, the Ark of the Covenant, and the cup, the Holy Grail. We'd all love to find those. If those were actually found, I will admit it, I would be the first person in line to go to that museum and check it out. I would want to see it. But actually finding any of those artifacts shouldn't impact our faith in any way. We should already have that faith. So yeah, they would be really, really awesome to find, but not necessary. Not necessary for us as believers.
Yeah. Well, I want to wrap this up before you tell me there's no Santa Claus. And
I would never do that.
Counted among the outlaws, he said, "Come, follow me." People from all walks of life since have been becoming outlaws.